Yeah, yeah. I said give a clue there. Yeah, Vidal had a very very strong vibes about what we are doing. So I told him I would share that with you. But I said I could have said directly, but a little bit of a pop quiz. I gave it too easy of a first
Yeah,
hint or
yeah.
clue. But yeah, it was a pretty good event yesterday. Number of people sharing. Of course, Chef Selwyn of the Art of Catering was on point with his
Wow.
food. He was really it was crazy, and had a rather long conversation with a gentleman I'm hoping we get on here, Dr. Carl James.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, he's a great brother. I've done a lot of work with him as well.
Yeah,
Research
yeah,
is next level, right? So bring him on. Bring him on.
yeah. He took my card, and I'm gonna see if I can get in touch with him because I would love to have him on because we had a deep dive conversation for about half an hour about what's going on south of the border. It was, and we were just like agreeing with each other, giving each other daps. We're on point. And it's funny because I hadn't seen him. I can't tell you the last time I saw him. And it was just like, wow. I said, yeah. So we're going to work to get him on Black Men Can Talk, which is a show where Black Canadian men come together to have real unfiltered conversations about life, culture, and community. What else has been going on? Kofi, give me one win from the last week. Talk to me.
Oh man, just one? Jeez.
Well, we do have a guest. We do have a guest.
So, well, we recently have been in the process of journeying with a group of young men in regards to rites of passage. So we've been today actually was a most recent session, vibrant group of young brothers, and it's just good to see what the future looks like as we like plant the seeds that are needed and necessary, right? For a lot of the things that we discuss and we talk about in community. There's a quote that says, if it doesn't survive descent, then it dies with those that created it, right? So at the end of the day, because we're working with these young brothers, you get to see the potential of what the future can look like if you actually take the time to plant the right seeds. So that's what we're seeing, and it's an amazing process, and it's also fun. It's joyful. Like we're in spaces where we're seeing their eyes light up around certain things, and also hearing their own wisdom and coming from, as they say, the mouth of babes, like young men with incredible thought, and reflection around certain things. So it's like we need to create these spaces more consciously. So I would definitely say that's a recent, journey, on the wind tip of things, 100%.
Few quick questions on that. First of all, how often do those conversations happen?
We meet monthly. And then we also have in between events and things like that that we engage and connect.
And what time do they happen when they happen?
So this is a particular session that we do on the Sunday, but when it comes down to, so that's what I'm referring to specifically. It was the session in which the conversation was taking place. But to be honest, it's funny you say that, Dr. Brad, because I would love at some point to have a conversation with the next generation on this platform.
You're reading my alleged mind on that. You're reading, and I'll put it out there too. As long as there's alignment right with Tom, I'd like to come in and join one of those sessions.
100%. It'd be great to have you as a guest and reasoning and connecting around what you do and the impact of how we can utilize technology and these social platforms, to allow 100%. Them to see how their voice can be heard and can support other young men to do the same.
Good stuff. Brother Sadat, one win, because I know there've been so many. Talk to me. One win over the past week, big or small.
I'm going to add to Kofi's win, because I was in that space today with these young men, incredible ages 13 to 16. One of the things that they're tasked with is to bring something for the meal. And you could imagine these 13-year-olds to 16 came with jerk chicken, macaroni pie, fufu and agusi. They came with some jollof rice.
What? Right? Jollof rice?
These folks are coming on a level.
Don't go to sleep. Don't go to sleep during today's show, okay? Don't go to sleep.
I only mention that because, obviously, people are with these young men, they're limited, they can't cook, they threw down. So I wanted to tell to those folks, but yeah, beyond that, a lot of big things coming up for Black History Month that I want to kind of go to and do that. So I'm very excited from what I'm seeing out there. And then I think one of the big wins, I'm gonna have to shout out Christopher Lawrence for sure. Frequency. I went to his event on Thursdays, kind of like a networking, get together. It was incredible to see other
Wow.
professional Black folks there, but also the venue they had it in. Black owned, African cuisine.
Mhm.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna have to make a
And we
step.
saw
I
COVID
gotta
then.
make a step there. Gotta make a
Yeah,
step
it
there
was good.
now.
It was good. It was good.
Okay.
It
Well,
was really
speaking of
good.
Frequency of Rep Promotions, he's here. Says greetings, Dr. Vibe. Greetings, Sadat. Greeting, Kofi. And
Yeah,
before we go to break, a little interesting thought. So we're hearing a lot about DEI these days.
Yes.
DEI, and it's diversity, equity, inclusion. Well, I was listening to a gentleman this evening, and he regards DEI as development, entrepreneurship, and investment.
Ooh, like it.
So we'll just leave to go to break on that note. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about the reparations thing, family. Oh, yeah, the reparations thing. And I'm going to say we have an expert that we've all known for many years who's, I guess, if you're looking at a map of Canada, he's on the right coast with us. So we're looking forward to having him. So we will be back in just a moment. Here we go. Good morning. Good morning. It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe show.
My name is Ryan Knight, one of the co-founders of the Afro-Caribbean Business Network. So he couldn't call an election now because that would be the most disastrous thing for the Liberal Party. I am predicting it's going to be this year where AI just starts to branch out on its own.
They did that on purpose.
You think so? Oh,
of course they did. Of course they did. All right. That is the Morning Vibe, Monday and Friday mornings live at 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific, with myself and co-host Ryan O'Neill Knight, who is the co-executive director of the African Canadian Business Network. I was going to say network. Yes, network. Before we get into things, subscribe to the Dr. Vibe Show on YouTube and hit the notification button. Also, like the Dr. Vibe Show on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram to advertise your business, product, or service on any of these platforms. Please email us dr.vibe at the drvibeshow.com. And finally, join our Discord group by emailing me at dr.vibe at the drvibeshow.com. All right. Who gets the honor of introducing our guests?
I can do that.
Please.
Very much so. As we introduce these brothers who come on the show, we never like to say too much because we want to give them an opportunity to just share who they are. Critical question, who am I? However, I'm just going to read a little bit a smidgen of this brother's bio. And I say it because, there's some very important things that we need to acknowledge, celebrate one of our own. So I know my brother as Chevy X. So I will keep it at Chevy X. And of course, at that time I say that, everybody's deciding to cook in the background. So if you hear some noise, it is happening. All right, so I hope everybody can hear me. But again, Chevy X, recognized as one of the global top 100 most influential people of African descent. MyPad, in politics and governance. Dr. Chevy X is a cross-pointed assistant professor in the Black and African Diaspora Studies program and the Department of Political Science at Dalhousie University. So our brothers on the East Coast. And then some of the things I want to highlight for folks really is that, although he's kind of shy to say this, we'll call him Dr. X. His current project argues for a decolonial and holistic undertaking of reparations in Canada by connecting the contemporary manifestations of anti-Black systemic racism to transatlantic slavery. That's what I really want to hear about.
All right.
It has been, in the offices of the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, letting folks know about the importance of, Pan-Africanism, the importance of reparations, the importance of making us whole as people of African descent. So without further ado, the doctor, professor, or Chevy X, our brother.
Greetings and salutation, brothers.
Greetings. Great to have you. Great to have you. How you been?
I've been blessed. I can't complain, to be honest. Been blessed. Family is good. Life is good. Life is interesting at the same time, but that's struggle, right? But I give thanks.
There you go.
Most definitely.
Who wants to kick it off? You know I can always, but who wants to kick it off?
First, I want to say thank you for having me on the platform. And it's, I'm not gonna lie, I tend to run away from those things, like the podcast piece. But when I was approached, I and just seeing what the podcast is about, the conversation with Black men, and what everyone in this podcast, I remember distinct moments where you each make a difference in my life, or some kind of decision influence my life in a particular way. And I'm not just saying that like as a cliche or two, but I genuinely mean that, particularly doing work at Ijima House, right? I know that's where I connected with most of you in different parts. So I'm very thankful to be here and just to be part of the conversation, and love what you're doing, especially around with Black men, right? Because I would say it played a major role in helping me see things differently, especially around being a father. So give thanks. Yeah.
Shay. So that's usually the first thing we ask when we greet each other. How is the family? How are the children? That's what we ask. So you're saying that everybody's well. That's great. The second question I'm going to ask, just put it out there. I love Halifax in the summertime. Never been doing the winter time, so I have to ask, brother, how is the weather?
What's interesting? I heard that before I went, and I was a little fearful. People always say, make sure you get the proper boots, etc. Halifax, it's not too different from Toronto. The thing is that it rains more. So even when you had the winter storms, like the snowstorms, I would say, like last month, if I'm not mistaken, or even in December, the weather was not as cold. It was snow, but then it would be followed by rain. So it might not be as cold. Yes, it'll be in the negative, but it'll just be wet, which is a different type of cold, right? So you feel it more in your bones. Yeah. But I would take that, to be honest, over the constant snowing and negative 20, 19, 18. I think you had a wind chill last week. But it's fine. It's just the pace is just slow. Right. Summertime, extremely green and very beautiful.
Yes. Right. So for those who have not been to Halifax, please make that journey. It's not just a beautiful space, but culturally, we know that it has a significance in the history of Canada and the history of Black people in Canada. So I'm gonna maybe I can start with something just in terms of somebody who's been kind of transplanted from Toronto. I know you from Toronto. What cultural differences have you come up against or noticed moving from Toronto to Halifax, specifically within the Black community?
You want good, bad, good, bad, bad,
Like good, bad, between it's just
cultural difference. What I'll say, before moving here, I never knew Halifax had 52 historical Black communities. The communities I remember would be, I think, was North Preston, East Preston, Africville, that doesn't exist anymore, on a few other Beachfield and a few other communities. But being here, understanding the history and those 52 communities, some don't really, honestly, doesn't, some of them in that whole gentrification type of piece. So 52 is debatable, but I was not familiar with that. What else? Africa Nova Scotians tend to be homebodies. So whereas in Toronto, we'll be more out doing the social thing, restaurants, events, etc. They do have the events. However, a lot of times they'll invite you to their home to eat. So, you might be walking downtown Halifax looking for Black folk. You might see them, but they might not necessarily be African Nova Scotian. Most of them, tend to be at home with family. And family there is extremely strong. Yes, it's in Toronto based on your family and connection, but family names, last name, you could just tell someone, okay, your last name, and they'll know what community you're from, how many generations, etc. So it's good to see that in a space like Canada. So culturally, Yeah, that's one of the differences. And also how Afrocentrism is rooted here. Ashanti values of Afrocentrism, it's rooted here in thinking of identity, in thinking of identity, in thinking of carving out space for oneself. Afrocentrism, Afrocentricity, I say, would say, is a key dialectic, a key discourse here in carving out one's identity, in finding oneself and connecting to the continent. So culturally, intellectually, um, bad like anywhere else, we don't romanticize black people. There's always politics around various things, but things that could be solved through a radical Pan-African intervention, I believe. Yeah.
Nice. Just have some comments here. Frequency Promotion says, "Thank you, brothers, for coming through. It truly meant a lot." And also, hello to Fitnet's IQ Cam, who has a great show on Saturday afternoons around 5-ish called Things I Wish I Knew About Money. So it's really good. Chevy, I want to know, what was the energy for you to start this journey about reparations, especially reparations in Canada?
Um. Now, how long is the podcast? No, I'm teasing.
You got time. I got time. I don't know the other guys, but
Um,
you go for it.
the reparations piece in Canada started for me outside of Canada. It actually started in the Caribbean. I'll even say before that, growing up I'm originally from St. Lucia, migrated to Canada in 2002 when I was 17, right after high school. It started for me in St. Lucia, having drowning and reasoning sessions with Rastafarians. At that time, I was a dedicated Pentecostal, born again, baptized in Jesus' name, um, young man. But however, one of the things I was always intrigued by was Rastafari liberty and Rastafari dialectic. I mean, I wasn't articulating it like that, but just the conversations and the reasoning piece. I was always intrigued by that. So reasoning of Rastafarians behind my childhood house in Balata, they opened my eyes to various things, various types of conversations. So I was first introduced to Marcus Garvey, and the significance of Marcus Garvey, the idea of being proud, the idea of self-actualization, self-determination, also the role of disciples. So the role of how certain music that will never die. For example, Bob Marley, Tupac Shakur, and a few others. So I was introduced to the role of music, Pan-Africanism, and the idea of repatriation. So repatriation is one of the tenets of reparations, as you know, Rastafari history from Jamaica and across the Caribbean, and even in the diaspora, repatriation to Africa is one of the key pillars, or part of the principles of Rastafari liberty. So I was exposed early in thinking about repatriation. Now, fast forward in 2015, I believe, when I did a fellowship at the UN, representing the Caribbean slash Canada. Even at the time in Toronto, I was doing a lot, as you know, doing community work across the city, across the GTA. But I was always thinking beyond Canada, beyond in the sense of how does Canada struggles is in conversation with what's taking place in the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, and Europe, Black Europe in particular. But I never knew the how to make those connections, like how in the sense of the physical connections. So when I did the fellowship inside in Chevy consciousness, I walked in there as a Caribbean integrationist, someone who strongly believe in one Caribbean, the power of a pan-Caribbean movement, an intellectual, cultural movement. And I strongly believe it could be as powerful as the West Indies cricket team from the late 70s to the early 90s, right? How the West Indies dominated. And I think to me, that have always been, in my consciousness. Right. So doing the fellowship, I was looking at what to present on, not necessarily on St. Lucia or Canada, but I wanted something that was more regional, that could speak about the Caribbean realities. And one of the things at the time, Hilary Beckles' book came out. Hilary Beckles, who is the vice chancellor of the University of the West Indies, he came out with a book in 2013 called British Black Debt, and he gave a historical analysis and also presented recommendations on what reparations could look like in the case of the Caribbean. So that book was creating a lot of noise in the region, and from that, CARICOM established the Caribbean Reparations Commission, which is the reparations movement is government led, and member states from CARICOM. CARICOM, for those who don't know, CARICOM is the regional bloc, particularly for the Anglophone Caribbean. You have countries like, well, I would say states, departments like Martinique, who are kind of, you would say, buffers or not necessarily members, but have access to CARICOM. But CARICOM is majority Anglophone Caribbean. Haiti is there as well, but CARICOM is majority Anglophone. So you have that government-led movement, which was also inspired by Rastafari as well. So even to answer your question, I have to give you that historical context, because the Canadian piece didn't just come out in the air, right? It's through that struggle and through that understanding. So in the fellowship, I was doing some research and drew from Hilary Beckel's text and what the conversations that was taking place at the time, because it was the same year that the first decade, International Decade for People of African Descent, was launched. So I was coming from that trajectory. So I did a presentation on the Caribbean reparations movement. And for me, I view the Caribbean reparations movement as a framework, a possibility for Caribbean integration, right? And integration not just from a political or economic level perspective, but the role of grassroots movement, the role of Rastafari, the role of young people, the role of other marginalized groups, Indo-Caribbean people, indigenous Caribbean people, right? As that like I mentioned, that Pan-African perspective. And just connecting with folks from Toronto, actually, like Sakaya Thomas, Global African Congress, right, being at the forefront of the global reparations movement. For those who don't know, one thing I like to give props and respect to people who paved the way from before, right? Sakaya Thomas, people used to ridicule them when they used to talk about reparations from the 90s, right? Make fun of them. And to a point where now people have jumped, that's what you want. You want people to jump on the gravy train, right? To make it mainstream. But when you see elders like that being marginalized or pushed to the side, I have an issue with it. But connecting and reasoning with Sakaya, learning the histories about movements, things I read in textbooks. Sakaya is giving me backstories of why decisions were made in certain countries, the noise they were creating privately, and being in those spaces. Sakaya Thomas is one person I think you should try to have on this on the podcast. He's I would say a walking history archival. He's a walking archive, I would say, right? So Sakaya Thomas, I recommend to have on the podcast to speak even about the histories and movements in Canada, Grenada and Maurice Bishop, and what was taking place in Canada. He was part of a lot of those things. So being with him, I learned a lot beyond, I would say, pre-2015. What was taking place in the Caribbean, what they were doing in Canada as well. So this is not new to Canada. And as you know, Global African Congress, Sakai is from Scarborough, Jamaican background, but grew up in most of his life in Canada. Right. So I learned a lot about David Commission, etc. Right. And now in my international work now, I'm the Caribbean ambassador for the Pan-African Council, and I'm part of a coalition called the International Coalition for People of African Descent. And with the International Coalition for People of African Descent is young people and other folks from around the world, in Colombia, Brazil, Spain, the US, across the Caribbean, across Africa, etc., came together to create that coalition to advocate for the human rights for people of African descent globally. Right, so it's a multi-language initiative. We have young people, different generations. For example, Muriel Fanon, France Fanon's daughter, is part of that. So we do a lot of work globally in support of the decade and support the right of Pan-Africanism and various issues people of African descent go through globally. For example, some of our key themes is reparations, and reparations not in the harm repair type of traditional way, but a revolutionary Pan-African approach to reparations, right? Transformative approach to reparations, right? Migrations, Pan-African solidarity, economic and trade, etc. And some of those folks that are part of this are actually, as the space, having conversation with them. The part of grassroots in Colombia, and some of those folks are now in political positions. As you know, in Colombia is the left-wing government, and Trump just threw some tariffs on them. 25%, and might jump into 50%, and it's apparently going to remove visas for government officials and their families. So literally that's taking place as we speak it. So there's a lot of things happening there. So even I'm saying this to say, how do we support each other in that moment? Right. So coming from that.
Chevy, give me 1 minute. Just give me 1 minute.
Yeah.
I wanted to because I'm hearing what you're saying in terms of it seems like the reparations movement in particular. I'm interested to hear what you're saying about two things. One, uh, it seems very Pan-African or very global.
Yeah.
And then two, you talked about young people being involved. So kind of maybe share the perspective of if it's what, first of all, what is Pan-African, just for some of our listeners, and then two, how did it evolve into kind of a Pan-African movement, the reparations piece? I'm interested to hear about that.
Okay. Before I answer that question, I'm just going to fast forward to give more context about Canada,
Yeah.
and I'll bring in the Pan-African piece. So I'm saying also saying all these global movements, right? Globally talking about reparations, the Caribbean is at the forefront, the US, etc. Canada's voice wasn't necessarily there in the sense of from a national point of view, like taken from a national perspective. So it was little blocks, right? You have people talking about it in Nova Scotia in particular. When you talk about historical reparations, when you think about Africville, a Black community that was dismantled in the late '60s by the government, Black people displaced, right? So my argument was, how do we look at historical reparations and connect it to look at the historical reparations and and the legacies of racial capitalism, the legacies of anti-Black systemic racism. So my intervention, well, with my collectives and my colleagues as well, is creating a strategic plan for reparations in Canada that's holistic and recognizes historical communities, like as I mentioned before, across Canada. You could even think about Buxton in Ontario, right? Secondly, for people like myself who are from the Caribbean, but living in the diaspora, what does reparation look like for me, right? For people like that. And the third aspect, people Black people who do not have any historical ties or coming from the legacies of transatlantic slavery. However, when they cross the border within Canada, they deal with that history because of their Blackness, right? So for example, East Africans, right? When they cross the border, they have to deal with those legacies. When you think about education, the education system, the violence of the education system for our children, when you think about the justice system, how we criminalize, how Black youth in particular are criminalized, adultified, as they would say, among other things. So that's the context of making that intervention from a Canadian perspective, right? And now to answer the question about Pan-Africanism, what is Pan-Africanism? So Pan-Africanism is basically when essentially countries working. Sorry, I just literally just talked about that like yesterday. So Pan-Africanism is basically connecting people of African descent on the African continent with people in the African diaspora. So working together and supporting each other and supporting the idea or the ideology of Africa first, basically. Well, not Africa first, but Africa is the roots, right? But they have different streams of it, right? You have that very neoliberal piece where it's like, okay, we're gonna, I don't know if I should put, you have that neoliberal piece, for example, what's taking place in Haiti, right? You have Kenyan government presidents sending troops, soldiers in Haiti from a Pan-African approach to say, okay, we're gonna support them because we're Black. However, that solidarity is not a healthy solidarity. So our intervention in the Pan-African piece is not in a sense of just supporting you because you're Black, but what are your politics? Right? What are your politics to deal with white supremacy? What are your politics to deal with the legacies of slavery and racial capitalism? So I know I gave you a lot, but it's important so when you talk about the Canadian piece to give context, historical context.
Yeah, context is definitely good. I don't know if the brothers have a question. I do have a question, but I don't know if you all.
I just want to jump in really quick. Minnie on Cam says evening. And also, if anyone's watching this live on my YouTube channel, The Dr. Vibe Show, I have a live panel going, a live poll going. Do you support reparations for Black Canadians? So it's yes, no, or not sure. And right now, 75% say yes, 25% not sure. So if you're on my YouTube channel, I encourage you to vote in real time. I want to hear from Kofi. Not heard anything from Kofi yet. Come on now.
Brother, we have the doctor dropping some science for the people that includes a historical connection to this place that we call Canada. So I'm creating space and loving the conversation thus far. Brother Chevy, blessed to see you again, brother. Always a good connection, always
Likewise.
positive energy, and it's always learning. We're always getting into reasonings that are of significance to our people. So I love, anytime I'm connecting with folks from the community who have that passion, I'm always moved and humbled. A couple of things come to my mind, and the funny thing I've always wondered is, so I'm wondering your perspective on why the decade of people of African descent, um, the first iteration, transitioning and then now it being extended, why you think perhaps that so many of our people are not tapped into that, and one, and then
Mhm.
two, not using it to our advantage relative to some of the initiatives that are supposed to align. Like there's an actual plan that was put in place
Mhm.
by the to be able to hold governments accountable and things of that nature. So I'm interested in one, why you think that maybe it's not as popular, quote unquote, in the current movement and community, and then two, what role it plays for our collective liberation.
Thank you for the question. Before you said the decade was extended. What do you mean? Sorry.
So
Because
initially,
there's something I want to say. I just want to make sure
mhm.
I'm
so
thinking
initially
of
it
the right
was
thing.
it was to end, quote unquote, in 2024, right? And then essentially it's been the United Nations has extended it to 2034. My understanding, to
Oh,
December
okay.
31st,
Yeah, yeah,
2034.
okay. No,
Yeah,
because the Canadian government extended it for 2, 3 years, and then they implement the UN eventually launched a second decade,
right.
right? So when you said extend, I don't know if you're referring to the
Got
Canadian government or the UN piece. So I just wanted to
got
clarify. Yeah, why I think it hasn't been popular? I think because I don't want to blame us. First, I think several reasons, right? For some people, they don't believe in the UN and its instruments, right? And that's understandable.
mhm,
I was part of that, or I would say I'm, I'm in between, and I'll explain and I'll respond to your second question. However, I think we could weaponize the decade, the second decade in particular. So I was actually part of the collective I'm part of, International Coalition, ICPAD. We actually advocated, one of the key organizations among other groups as well, that advocated for a second decade. I actually presented in the UN for the third session of the Permanent Forum last year, speaking on the second decade, right? And I'll speak more to that to answer your second question. And that came out of, I would say, collective struggle. So what we did, we
mhm,
held a preliminary meeting in Zambia, Lusaka, Zambia, in March, if I'm not mistaken, last year, where we brought government officials, folks from the UN, members of the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, and the Permanent Forum came out of the decade. The Permanent Forum is a cohort of people of African descent, most of them, that are like the buffer between civil society and the UN. So where you have the working group of experts of people of African descent from the UN, they tend to deal more with member states, and they don't necessarily, they might not have that relationship with civil society. So a permanent forum was created to kind of be that bridge to leverage, right, between the UN mechanisms and civil society organizations slash grassroots, right? So we held a preliminary meeting and we brought community together from across Africa and the African diaspora. And we came out with themes and the significance and why. And for what we advocated for, to have a second decade that focused primarily on reparations. So in the first decade of the question you asked, the key themes, the three themes were recognition, justice, and development. Recognition in regards to recognizing the historical crimes and the contemporary situation of people of African descent globally, as a consequence of transatlantic slavery slash racial capitalism. Um, justice needs to be done, and what does that look like in a sense of development? I think when the first decade was launched, um, it was not publicized the way it needed to be publicized. And people, and what does that mean for community, right? We talk about a decade. How do we weaponize? How do we use it? So I think, and that's when we're talking about reparations in Canada, in creating a national reparations commission, like to strategize on how we could work together around the decade. So the same way organizations will have different committees to do different type of work. It would have been good for them to have a national committee or some kind of working group that could study and work with people of African descent across Canada in exercising or executing some of the key recommendations. I know in Nova Scotia they created a center, came out of that of the decade. So you have that in the province of Nova Scotia, but it would have been good to have it from a national perspective. Also, it was I think young people were not tapped into it as the way they should have been. I think for it to be publicized, young people had to be at the forefront and not just tokenizing those conversations. They have to be part of the decision-making processes and tapping it using social media, using TikTok, right? We can't just go around and hand out flyers, and send out emails. Those things don't work. That's different time, different generation. So I think we have to, young people are creators of culture. How do we tap and work with them? And not just in the sense of exploiting, but them having the knowledge and believing, and connecting to whatever they're doing. So if they're part of, let's say, Ijima House talking about Black fathers, how you could get those Black fathers involved in those conversations, right? And then they could think about what the decade means to them. What are the issues or the barriers that they're dealing with? And those barriers could be tied with the larger conversation with the decade, right? So now with the second decade is about now executing a lot of the things that were done. The lot of things that were recommended or the gaps created, the gaps recognized. How do we build off that? So initially, we were all advocating for a second decade to do with reparative justice, right? And reparative justice don't necessarily have to do with historical crimes. Reparative justice could be around housing crisis. When we talk about health, mental health issues, they have scholars that have connected anti-Black racism to as part of as mental health issues as a byproduct of anti-Black racism. You have scholars like Joy DeGruy who have coined terms as like post-traumatic slave syndrome, that's saying trauma is intergenerational, and we embody that, right? You have scholars that's talking about those things. So how do we connect those things to as part of the legacies of transatlantic slavery, right? Because my argument, I've been speaking with my group about this, reparations need to happen from a holistic perspective. All the work that we are doing, all of the work that you are doing, that could be connected to a restorative justice framework. So because sometimes the way we think about reparations, we think about those historical things, but it is more than that, right? Because we are walking with those histories right now, right? Yeah.
Just want to do a reset. Myself, Dr. Vibe, Kofi, and Sadat are with, I would say, Dr. Cheviak, but I'm just going to say Cheviak. He just like to be Cheviak. Have a Professor Dalhousie University. We're talking about reparations. I want to ask Chevy, why is the reparations movement important for Canada, a country that often sees itself removed from the history of transatlantic slavery?
I think you just answered the question. One, in the sense of, Canada, Carl, you mentioned Carl James a while ago, right? Earlier on, just before I came in. Carl and I have this conversation all the time. We're actually working on something together on reparations and education. Like maybe we had a conversation 3 days ago, and he was speaking about his argument is when we're talking about reparations and thinking about reparations, we must think of it from a transnational perspective. I'm going to answer your question, right? From a transnational perspective. So, for example, there's a particular time, I think in the 19th century, where you had African Nova Scotians or Black Scotians with Caribbean background. And after a while, they shipped them to Trinidad, right? In the sense of like in a sense of reparations is not limited to the US and Canada, but it's a wider scope. So Canada plays a role into that, right? As a Afua Cooper, I use a book all the time for my class called The Hanging of Angelique that talks about the history of slavery in Canada and protests. When you think about Marisha Angelique, who was accused of burning down Montreal, what you call Old Montreal, right, and was tortured into confessing that, that she was the cause of the fire. That's for the listeners who are interested in knowing those histories. I'm throwing those things in there, right? That book, The Hanging of Angelique, gives you a history of slavery in Canada. And Afua argues that although Canada was not a slave society, that is a society that practiced a society that have plantations, last plantations like you have in the Caribbean, the southern part of the US and certain parts of Latin America. It was a society that still had enslaved people, right? So in a sense, you had enslaved people doing housework, trades, individuals, right? They were bought and sold from the Caribbean, from the US into Canada. In addition to that, slavery was the industry, or the plantocracy of slavery was not limited to the plantation, but there was the economic aspect and the development of industry. So for example, a lot of slave ships came from Canada in New Brunswick, Newfoundland, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of the ships were created from forestry there. So right there, you see the linkages, right? For those of you who are, from the Caribbean, Jamaicans and Lucians, I mentioned those countries because part of your national dish is saltfish. Saltfish is not from the Caribbean. Saltfish comes from Canada and Norway, right? And the history of saltfish, so the reason why saltfish was in the Caribbean because it was cheap food that could be preserved, right? So then there was barter taking place, there was trading taking place. So all that tariffs we're talking about, they have history with that, right? So that trading was taking place, right? So rum was created, sugar, etc., was traded in Canada for saltfish, And also when you think about breadfruit is not even from the Caribbean. There's a side point. Breadfruit is not indigenous to the Caribbean. It's something that was important as something food that could be stored and cheap, right? So when you think about saltfish, when you think about the slave ships, when you think about people that were banks, the banks that Bank of Nova Scotia, those banks, wealth created came from slavery, right? And part of the thing, going back to Carl always make the point that we have to think about is transnational. He Beckles as one of his articles called Reparations is the greatest movement of the 21st century. And he makes the example of two brothers. He gives us an example of two brothers. Both of them were based in Antigua. One moved to Boston, and the other one stayed in Antigua to run the plantation there. And that money that came from Antigua is the foundation for the Harvard School of Law, right? Wow. So it's showing you how those things were not limited to borders, but they went across borders, right? And the other argument is that a lot of people that own that wealth, even now, they were friends and family, right? They were friends and family. They live on the same street in England. You know what I'm saying? When you think about Bathurst, Dundas, all those names that are cross English-speaking colonies or former colonies, those individuals were friends, right? So the money was not limited to those spaces. Most of the money did not even stay in those spaces unless it was in the US and Canada eventually later on, but it all went, in most cases, to England. That dominated the slave trade post the late 18th century, where they dominated the slave trade, right? So for us, we have to think about it transnational. And one thing I love about how CARICOM, the Caribbean Reparations Campaign, is doing their reparations agenda, the 10-point plan that they created, is not limited to families. It's a social development project, right? So for example, the 10-point plan, the first one is an apology. The second one is the Indigenous Knowledge Program, where the genocide that was committed in the Caribbean, and the same argument could be made in Canada and the US as well. The genocide that was committed against Indigenous people, a knowledge program, should be there to support them and to educate the general public about Indigenous people, because people always say Indigenous people don't exist in the Caribbean. I was speaking to my Indigenous friend from the Caribbean like 3-4 hours ago who's doing work on indigeneity in Guyana from the Lokono people, right? So the CARICOM have that piece. The third point is the African Knowledge Program. In regards to the violence that was done towards African people that separated us, we have to have a kind of knowledge program to learn about and from each other, right? And I'll give you an example. I was in Kenya working on a initiative in my other organization on trade and investment between Africa and the Caribbean. And I was speaking to a couple of Kenyans, and all they knew about the Caribbean is that we run very fast, right? That was the understanding of people in the Caribbean. And then when you could ask people in the Caribbean, what do you think of African people? And you could think about all the negative stereotypes. So there's a disconnect, the educational disconnect, a cultural disconnect that we need to have those type of exchanges and learn from each other and about each other, right? So that's a piece. The other thing is, and I'm highlighting CARICOM 10-point plan for us to think of ways as a community and nationally of what reparations could be like in Canada, right? Other point is cultural infrastructure. So whilst Europe and England was developing its wealth, it took a lot from the Caribbean, right? Industries weren't created, industries were destroyed. Well, industries were never created. So investing and creating things like research center, cultural centers, museums, right? So even the arguments and discussions historically have been going in Canada around museums and cultural center, having national centers. Some of the arguments is like it should be in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Some of it should be in Montreal, but we could have more than one, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about having one. We have to think beyond the idea of the scarcity of resources. Canada has money, right? But anyways, so I gave that example about CARICOM first to think of a national undertaking of the Canadian piece. So for some people, they might not be able to trace that. So they think like, you know what, I'm from the Caribbean, I'm from Africa. We don't need we don't need no reparations. People don't even know that slavery existed in Canada. So as much as Harriet Tubman was freeing the enslaved and bring them to Canada on the Underground Railroad, you also had a reverse Underground Railroad. People were living the horrors of violence and slavery and kind of going back to the US. We don't talk about those things, right? And those things these things inform our contemporary lives, right? So when we talk about the legacies, historically, when we think about education, segregated schools, these things coming out of slavery, right? When you think about the justice system, police, the history of police came from our slave catchers and slave African catchers, Africans who were seeking refuge. That police force was created out of that, and that extended in Canada as well. That's why we have that history, that tensions with police across Canada and the US, right? Those things that didn't just come out of the open. That's why it's important to know that history for us to understand what's taking place in our contemporary space, right? So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I know we have a lot of comments. I don't know if you want to bring some stuff up.
I just want to say something quick.
Yeah.
So for those that are listening in addition to us who are sitting here, right, hearing Brother Chevy speak and all of the information that he shared with us, this is the brother who said he shies away from podcasts. I just want to be clear. And this is the brother that said
I like to have those conversations. They're sitting and reasoning together, groundings, like Walter Rodney would say. That's my vibe,
But
we give thanks.
Got you. Well, I say that in not in a teasing way, but just to say that, brother, more people need to hear your voice. And what I mean by that is there's you're connecting so many different pieces because you're coming from the Caribbean to Canada, going from Toronto to Nova Scotia. Like your journey itself, right, spans and connects to so many different spaces and people that I feel as though it would be amazing to have you in these spaces more if it's something that you haven't been doing as much, just to create this dialogue and open up the door, I think, for the next generation of young people. Because something that I'll just briefly say, something that always touched me was hearing African historians speak and connect these different aspects around our social political situation and how culture plays a role in terms of our liberation and what those things look like when you break them down. And I think that some of that is being lost. And I think for young people, you have a capacity to essentially maybe connect to a younger audience than maybe older historians might. So to be in these spaces, I just want to say I think it's really epic and important to create this dialogue. And this is another part 2 situation that has to take place.
The new name of the show is going to be part 2, because every time we have a great guest like yourself on, always say what? There has to be a part 2.
Go ahead. Well, just before I'm going to hand it back to Paul, just to update on the poll on my YouTube channel. Do you support reparations for Black Canadians? 75% say yes, 12% say no, and 12% not sure. Back over to you, Paul.
Yeah. So, Dr. Chevy, or Chevy X, we call it, his brother's dialoguing, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I wonder about, because you hear, first they came out with 40 acres and a mule, in regards to reparations, And then you hear a lot of people talk about a dollar figure when it comes to reparations. So what's your thoughts on, I guess, a economical type of reparation? What does that look like for you? And yeah, just yeah, what's your idea about that?
For me, I think I think the economic stuff is important, especially for our community, right? When you think of reparations for Jewish people who, went through the Holocaust, some of those folks still get a paycheck in the bank account, right? So I believe in the economic aspect. That's important. However, so I believe in I believe in multiple iterations of reparations, right? So the 40 acres on a mule, what does that look like in today's context, right? How do we value that? Right. I remember a comedian gave a joke, 40 acres and a Cadillac, right? That was back in the day, a few years ago. But what does that look like in a contemporary setting? And I think so. Even when you ask me, for me, one thing I try my best, like I have certain ideas, but I always rather hear from people, right? Because it's not necessarily about me. So I believe in various iterations. So for example, um, people from historical Black communities in Canada will think of reparations differently. A lot of it have to do around land, right? Ties and access to land that they lost. Land that, when you think, I give the example of Africville as one community. Some communities right now are losing land through gentrification, etc. Across Canada, some of those historical Black communities. So I believe that reparations look different based on individuals. And that's why I said earlier on is that this triangulation methodology is like a three-tier piece, right? So what barriers have been put in place for people like me who are from the Caribbean living in Canada? And I give examples of justice, health. We could talk about access to proper housing. You could think about getting access to loan, justice, etc. Right? So people will have different ideas. So I'll tell you the various iterations. And then you have people, like I mentioned, have no connections with transatlantic state, but have to deal with the horrors of systemic, anti-Black systemic racism, right? For me, I believe in this holistic, transformative, what I'll say a decolonial type of reparative justice. Because our people get all the money in the world, but if we don't have the proper systems in place and institutions in place that could help nurture and grow that money, I think we'll just, there's and you can't, and that's fine. The money might survive or it might not survive. And I don't want to throw this out there, but that's the type of system we're in. It's about exploitation, capitalism, etc. Right? What's the role of the bank, right? So the system wasn't made for us. So what I think the decolonial piece have to come with a kind of internal liberation as well, a certain type of consciousness, right? And I think that's part of the I would say the journey of reparative justice. So what are the roles of the elders and people to work with community? So the various work that people are already doing, that's what I was saying, I think it could be connected to a larger conversations about reparations. So earlier on, when you were talking about the blessings for the day, speaking with young men between the ages of 13 to 16, people bringing their food, that's a form of reparative justice, that community healing and bonding, right? So with certain type of consciousness, certain type of education, we could think of and articulate it based on how we want it. As I mentioned, CARICOM seat goes there as a social development project. Like regardless of who you are, as long as you're in the Caribbean, you might get access to things because it's taken up from a government, nation building perspective, a social development project. And in Canada, it could vary, right? What does justice look like for people in marginalized communities that have been historically discriminated against and being exploited? It will look different from Black people living in Vancouver who have been there for 6, 7, 8 generations, right? So that's why I think it's important for us to have those conversations. And when you have experts, and the experts don't necessarily be reparative justice experts, but people are already doing the work. People like, for example, in the so I was going to give example. I've been in Nova Scotia for a little while. I was going to give examples. I always use Nova Scotia. People that are working in the Justice Institute in Africa, Nova Scotia Justice Institute. People are working around justice. People are working in education. People are working around mental health, like Black Health Alliance. Like, what are the roles of those organizations and community leaders and politicians in creating that piece? So that's why when I talk about the holistic, this is not an isolated conversation. I see it as something that's authentic and grounded in we civil society slash grassroots movement, right? Yeah.
Got a question here, and I think you may have covered it, but if you want to add on. Madonna Eugene says, how can reparations be structured to address both the historical and ongoing impacts of systemic racism while ensuring meaningful economic and social equality?
That's my sister. I know why she asked me this difficult question.
Listen, great brains running one family. It's all good. I love it. Go ahead, sister.
Yeah, I kind of speak to that in a sense of in dealing with particular areas. So, for example, my sister is in the legal field, right? You have the legal experts working with various organizations like that. Let's say a Justice Institute, like I mentioned earlier on, in doing research and cultivating particular solutions. So looking at that historical piece, what is it in the system? What is happening in the system that continues to exploit individuals? So targeting it based on various institutions and various sectors, right? So it's not a one size fits all, as I mentioned, because class plays a role. I might not be impacted, I'm comfortable, I might not be impacted as people coming from working class, families or marginalized communities. So they look different from them from a more of a contemporary perspective. So access, right? What is happening in the school system, regardless of class, as long as you're Black, you're gonna deal with those realities, right? What is happening there have been there historically, right? And I'm working on something and doing a lot of research, and I just learned about this report that came out in 1994 in Nova Scotia called the Black Education Report. That gives and it's a 3-volume report, probably like 500 pages. That gives you the history of Black people in Nova Scotia and the historical violence they have endured since 1994, wow. Right? And it ties that history, right? You have folks like you mentioned, Carl James, of various educational institutions that have been doing that type of work as well in the education perspective. And when you read their work, they always give it a historical context, right? So I cannot give the solution for everything, but it's understanding the history, contextualizing. That's why I started with my giant spiel about the global reparations movement. I know it sounded like I was all over the place, but to make sense of the Canadian situation, we had to locate Canada in that historical or that global movement, and that's the same thing too, right? Yeah.
All right. So I have another question, if you're okay.
Sure.
With this. So one of the things, when we talk about the context of reparations, we're all often focusing on people in the diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
What does it look like on the continent itself? In terms of are people involved in movements around reparation, and what does that look like for people who are on the continent of Africa itself?
Thank you. I love that question. Good thing I almost forgot. I needed to address that. So thank you for that question. Various movements of reparations are taking place in the African continent. CARICOM just signed, I was saying in December early December 2023, late November, CARICOM and the African Union had a reparation convention. And I was fortunate to partake and be there. And they were talking about what does reparative justice look like for them. So from a government perspective, you had that idea of trade and investment between the two regional blocks. From a grassroots perspective, I give the example about the young woman in Kenya, right? Or the young women in Kenya that think of the Caribbean a particular way, right? So it's having those kind of cultural experiences to learn from each other, right? And what I would say between I'm going to say something very controversial, and I apologize before I even to get to that question. I have a colleague of mine, African American scholar. She was the founding member of the Philly Reparations, I would say Philly Reparations Committee, and she is at Penn State. And her research is on tracing the money of people who benefited from transatlantic slavery. And she landed some interesting places, right? That might, well, like I was saying to her, it'll have some tension, but it's important that we address those realities, because people might use that as one of the, I would say, arguments against reparative justice, right? And some of the people that landed where the money landed was some communities that benefited in the African continent from slavery. I was in a meeting with a other brother, some colleagues of mine last week, um, in just I forgot it, like sorry, in some of them were in Colombia, a couple of them were on the African continent. I was in Canada, and the other one in Europe. And the conversation was they were about to do a citizenship ceremony for people in the diaspora, to get the citizenship. And not Africa. I need to double check which country. I don't want to give the wrong country, but I know it's not Ghana, right? To get their citizenship, if they could make connections to that particular country. And in conversation with him, he's one of those global Pan-Africanists as well. Originally from the US, left everything, and now he's based in the continent. And he has said to me in conversation some time ago, like, you remember he approached one of the chiefs in one of the villages that where he lives, and he said to them, like, I trace my ancestry there, etc. And communities have benefited. And the chief said, yes, we did benefit, and that's how we made our money, right? So to answer your question, reparative justice in those type of situation, I see it as a relationship repair, right? So when you have the harm repair, where it's like, okay, a violence was done, we get some money from wherever, Europe, Canada, the US, etc. I think in the case of Africanist diaspora, it's about repairing a damaged relationship. Because, and it's important that I mention that, because I don't want to just give a half argument about that piece. A lot of people have, within the continent, there's always, war. Like, people have always had the tensions, right? Slavery existed in the continent, but a different type of enslavement. So people would be enslaved, but would have gotten the freedom. People could have been, the enslaved could have been leaders in that particular community. So there are ways one could participate in that society. Chattel slavery, when you think about transatlantic slavery, something completely different from that history. Chattel slavery completely dehumanized individuals and turned them into things. What Amy says they will call thingification, where one became an object, one became a cattle, right? So one lost the humanity completely. So when we talk about the legacies of slavery, that's part of the legacies, the way the interactions with police and Black people, the interaction of Black people and everything, white institutions, right? Because of the history of the thingification, the objectifying, the dehumanizing of people of African descent, right? So I'm saying there's a complete difference with chattel slavery and slavery that existed in the African continent. So when one has tensions with different groups and foreigners coming out and giving you weapons, yes, you go behind your enemy and you sell them, not knowing the system that you're part of. So, and some of those communities that benefited sometimes got absorbed, dismantled, right? Where you actually had to look at people protecting communities. So I'm not saying that as an excuse, but we have to give the whole story. And I don't want to leave there as this Africans benefited, and yeah. So going back to your question on the continent piece, we need to have some type of relationship repair. So when you see African Union and CARICOM doing that, this is a relationship repair, because we should have been trading, long time. Next thing, Donald Trump and then put the 25% to 50%, and we have to find new partners. Let's trade within the region and externally as well, right? To our brothers and sisters on the continent, right? So that's one aspect. And what does that mean for civil society? Cultural exchanges, right? That's one aspect, right? In May of African Liberation Day, May 25th, which is also my older daughter's birthday, I'll be in Kenya with the University of Nairobi signing an MOU with the Pan-African Institution. And the idea is to bring Dalhousie University, and I've invited other scholar friends of mine in different parts of different universities in Canada and grassroots to work around reparations in regards to relationship building. So they have different ways. I just want a couple of examples, but I strongly believe it's about relationship repair. And with the relationship repair, we could talk about economic, we could talk about trade, we could talk about cultural movements, etc. Yeah.
Love the answer. Love that answer. That was so deep, and it really, it was just so broad, and us again not really thinking about just in one way. But I like the idea of repair, because I think definitely that's something that's a consistent theme, especially between diasporic Africans and continental Africans, if we want to call it that way. But thank you much for that.
And let me add one more thing. And we also have to remember, in that relationship repair, colonialism also happened on the African continent. So for those people who have never been to Africa and want to go to Africa, You might not just ex-African saying, welcome home, my brother, my sister. No, you also have to recognize colonialism happened there. So they might not like you, some might love you. They'll
Yes.
welcome you. So you have different experiences. So we have to keep that in mind, right? The Africa that we left behind does not exist anymore, right?
Mhm.
It's a different type of Africa, and one of the elders there, um, oh my gosh, what's his name there? Sorry, he said to me, when you go into Africa, and brother Oji as well, going to Ghana, brother Oji always have to hear brother Oji. He said to me, don't think about what Africa you have to do for you, but what you have to do for Africa, in that sense, right? And recognizing those issues, as much as we have our battles there, the people that over there have their battles as well. So we should not romanticize it. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. I'm gonna give way to my brothers. Go ahead, my brothers.
If not, I can jump in.
That holistic lens is a brief one, which is really I really was interested in the holistic lens aspect, and I feel like in addition to the connection between the arts, culture, and this like storytelling, right? The whole oral culture. And I'm interested in how you're tying those pieces together and what it looks like on the ground. Chevy, that's one part of my question. The second part um, is what role, everyday people you feel can play right across the diaspora to contribute to the reparation movement. So those are my two questions.
Mhm. You talk about the authentic piece of the arts and culture. Say that first question again. Sorry.
Yeah, the connection between how arts and culture can play a role in addition to traditional storytelling. We've used music to be able to not
Yeah.
only tell our narratives but also
Yeah.
has been used in movement. So just how you're connecting also those two, because I know there's something in there in your research.
Yeah. I think young people, and I go back to young people to answer your first question around arts and culture. I think, not I think, arts, the creative arts or the creative imagination could go beyond spaces my voice or other reparation advocates or scholars, grassroots movements cannot go, right? I think stories and understanding and learning exactly what is reparations. So some of the things I in my PhD research, I advocated for sometime a cultural movement, right? A cultural movement led by young people using social media as an example. So even just giving like a PSA, what exactly is reparations? Using theater, in the Caribbean days, in the 60s and 70s, theaters, well, even before the 60s and 70s, theater was something that people would go to learn about, what's taking place in this space or outside of this space, right? Calypso music, reggae, reggae is fundamental in the work that I do. When you think about Bob Marley and his lyrics, you have various iterations of reparations. So the arts and culture have always played a tool as a place where one could speak, share and learn from each other, right? So I see it as so. For example, when you think of Quinton Fossetti, a young, as should all know Quinton, if I'm not
Big
mistaken,
up,
who is
Quinton.
who's an Afrofuturist. In part of his work in thinking about the futures of Black people, that's part of thinking of the reparations piece. So when he's doing work with people in Brazil and Africa, wherever, that's some of the cultural connections that could take place where we don't necessarily have to move physically, but our work could move, right? So everything now is discussed here today. What does that look like in a creative piece? What does that look like in a film? Right. So even earlier on when you mentioned about being shy, and I said I like to do the groundings thing, I like to use films or create short films to show to communities and reason about those things, right? So traveling, showing films about love, whatever it is, reparation, and then breaking it with community to explain to community. And if they have questions, they ask those questions, right? So I see the art playing a role like that, right? And when you talk about the everyday person, and what role do they play, is even when you go back to the decade, and I would say like with civil society organizations, how do you tap and utilize those international instruments, right, for your benefits, right? You tap on those, but you build with community. And I see reparations when you talk about holistic peace, not just the physical movement or the gaining some kind of material resources, but I think there's an internal liberation that needs to take place, right? And I think what we're talking about, and I know the work that you do, Brother Kofi, about that internal liberation and empowerment, I think that's part of the reparation aspect as well, that consciousness raising, right? And through that consciousness raising, we could make those local connections, national connections, and international connections. So when even think about this, the work actually going back to your Brother Kofi, how do you articulate that from a restorative justice perspective? a liberation of self, right? Because going back to what I was talking about with the dehumanization of people of African descent, some of us have taken on that consciousness of being less than, right? Systemically, I'm not blaming us, but the system has positioned us historically and through the education system, through the justice system, through media, through various cultural expressions that we are less than. So what's the role in talking about the holistic piece in that internal liberation? I think that's one of the multiple ways, talk about civil society and everyday person. So you might not necessarily be on the street with a placard saying reparations now. That'll be good. That'll be, great, right? Big up yourself. However, they have different ways, right? Because I think everything, based on the work I know you do, all three of you, all that's tied into some aspect of reparative justice. So when we talk about the holistic piece, this is what I'm referring to, right? Material and non-material aspect of it.
So, Chevy, what do you feel are the biggest challenges facing the reparations movement, not only in Canada but globally?
In Canada, I would say is, so even when you put the poll on 25% said no, or unsure, 12 said unsure. I think that's part of it, is selling the idea to people for now, because although it is not new, but the Convention on Reparations in Canada, people have been advocating for and have received various forms of recompense historically, even during times of enslavement, is beginning to become part of the mainstream conversation, right? I think that's what we need to do, right? And this is going back to your question you asked me, Brother Kofi, in regards to the role of culture, the creative expressions, right? We make it become part of the culture. If you listen to any kind of American, urban/black kind of media, film, etc., even on radio show, people always talk about, this is my kind of reparations, like reparations is as part of the everyday. They might not know exactly what it looked like, or how people are thinking. They might have a way of thinking about it, but it's part of the conversation. I think what we need to do right now in Canada is making it part of the conversation for people to genuinely see a strategic plan. So this is where I am at initially, and it's not as an individual thing, but it's something I want to do nationally. So when I made my presentation at the UN, talk about 12 plans just based on what research was saying. However, it's something that needs to be updated through dialogue and exchanges with community across Canada. So I'll say that a challenge is just, I won't say a challenge, but I'll say where we are and what we need to do, right? And also, I think with the shift of government now, it's going to be very interesting. I strongly believe the Liberals are going to go out of power. Even the upcoming supposedly prime minister and his conversations around political identity, political identities, DEI initiatives, right? Just the hostility towards that. I think it'll be very interesting to see, how things unfold in Canada. And I think the way we need to combat that is through collective struggle, a national collective struggle. Everybody have their role to play. How do you find your role and how do we support each other, right? From a global perspective, Donald Trump and all what's taking place, right? I think that's part of it. The naysayers, the barriers, the institutions, for example, international law. International law plays a major role in denying people of African descent access to reparations. International law has its roots in transatlantic slavery. International law was created to protect people who benefited and invested in transatlantic slavery. International law still holds still protects those individuals even when you try to, advocate for reparations. For example, there's this thing called there's this argument that has been made, I should say, that you don't have any enslaved people that live anymore, so we can't trace it, right? That's easy to debunk because we could talk about the historical aspect and the legacies of that. So these are some of the examples international law is pushed to protect people in power, right? So the barriers are to using the same instruments that enslave us as tools of liberation, right? So how do we create and think of our own instruments, our own tools to hold those nations, people, industries who benefited, like the Catholic Church, like the Vatican, who benefited from slavery? How do we hold them accountable and not just throwing money aside and saying, okay, no, but have dialogue with us. Let's quantify to all those years how much money you owe us. If you can't pay us now, it could be over generations. And this is exactly what happened. And I'm going to show something very contemporary. So even people are denying why people deserve reparations. I believe in 2015, 2016, the royal family came out with a tweet saying, "We like to thank British taxpayers. They have helped us pay the reparations debt to the individuals who benefited from it, for the people who invest in reparations." So basically, what does that say? When slavery was abolished, right? When England abolished enslavement, they did not pay the newly freed African reparations. However, what the Slavery Act did, the Slavery Act, people reference it a lot in the US too as well. The Slavery Act further claimed that people of African descent belong, are basically property to enslavers. That helped with liberation, but what it also did, they did not receive money because they were part of property. You know, Ronaldo Walker have a very interesting book called Property that speaks to that as well. So the enslavers received 47 million pounds, right? At the time, I think that's equal to billions of dollars when you think of the contemporary piece, which was at the time 1/3 of the national treasury, I'll say, or the treasury of the British government. And that only got repaid in 2015. And a lot of people did not know that. So there was a lot of people criticizing, they eventually took the tweet down. What it says that people, British citizens, have through the tax, were actually paying people over generations for the loan taken out by the government. So imagine that you, a descendant of an enslaved living in Britain, you were actually using your tax money to pay off those people that invested, benefited. So the idea that reparations is limited just to the past, that argument is dismantled right there. So it shows you how it works with us in the contemporary, right? So these are some of the barriers, but I'm just showing the connection at the same time. And I believe the solution, I won't just talk about the barriers. I strongly believe the solution is a global Pan-African radical undertaking of reparations.
Sadat?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so within the reparations movements, you know, obviously, like you're saying, you have different iterations and different folks philosophies who believe what it looks like. One of the pieces sometimes is around return to Africa, back to Africa. You know, so folks who would be willing and open to go back because we were displaced, obviously not through our will. If we want to go back, and that includes, I guess, it'd be land back as well. But what do you think about that aspect of the reparations movement? So people who or having folks return to Africa who are willing. Peace.
Sorry, I heard your question. I'm just trying to go to my WhatsApp to see the country. So I'll answer your question.
No worries.
I support that 1,000%. And that's actually one of the tenets of the CARICOM 10-point plan, the idea of repatriation for people of African descent who want to. So it goes back to the question you had asked me earlier on in regards to reparations and the African continents. So part of the relationship repair, I think that will fall under that category in the sense of going back and also getting your citizenship, getting access to land. How do you get integrated into the society, right? So I think that's a transnational conversation that needs to happen and is already taking place. So I think that also should be part of the tenets of when we're thinking about it in Canadian as a national undertaking of reparations, where if it's supported, then the government then will have to support that financially or whatever way possible to help people of African descent return to the African continent, whether through investment or whatever ways they could unpack and support. So I support that 1,000% for sure.
Okay.
And these things have been happening. People have been repatriating for a while, especially since the summer of 2020. A lot of young people are moving at a higher rate to the African continent. In my time in Kenya, even before that, I would say, when I was in Ghana last year or 2 years ago in 2023, I went to what do you call it? Some festival, this vegan festival. What am I calling it? So let's go to this vegan festival. I ran into so many people from Scarborough.
Hey, hey,
A lot
hey.
of young people, some people haven't seen it in a while. I'm like, sometimes black people look like somebody remind you of your friend. So you always being careful. And it's like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I didn't see in a few years. When I say black people look like African people remind me of some of my solution friends. You could see the facial structure, etc. So I
Yeah.
wasn't sure. I thought it was one of those moments. And the
Yeah.
person that's actually putting the event together was from Scarborough.
Jeez.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? So
Chevy, you may not understand, but you just gave like a 10-pointer to us Scarbarians.
Yes.
You, you,
Yes.
you understand
yeah,
what you just caused on these airways, but
yeah, man.
point is well taken. Good.
Exactly. And even when I was in Nairobi, I met this one brother, musician, find out he have this whole beautiful restaurant downtown Nairobi, this Aita restaurant, and through there meeting so many Caribbean people, communities from the US and Canada, the the black Moors, even some of them. I'm like, you're rich all in Kenya too. So even those type of connections, and so people have been moving, right, for the last 4 or 5 years at a higher drove, yeah.
And doing well. A lot of them doing well
Yes,
relative to the movement and the work that's being
yeah.
done on the ground. And even from a
Mhm.
cultural standpoint, I think the piece that you mentioned about the integration is key. Because I remember years ago, one of my locticians, she said to me that back in, I think it was the sixth or maybe late 60s, early 70s, there was a movement of folks that were coming from Toronto and moving to the continent. And the issue was when they landed and started to kind of get their feet on the ground, some people looked at it as a kick up your foot situation and now you're in paradise, alluding
Mhm.
to what you mentioned earlier, as opposed to what is the work on the ground? What are we supposed to be doing? What skills are we bringing that can
Mhm.
empower and strengthen the work on the ground there, and whatever resources that can be utilized, right? So I think there's a lot of that takes place too, right? Is that, as you talked about, the romantic
Most
aspect.
definitely. There's this brother was from Atlanta. It's interesting. I met him in Ghana with brother Oji. Give thanks to brother Oji. He had organized this reasoning dinner session in the botanical gardens in Abura, I think in Ghana. And then there's this brother from Atlanta and the other sister from Scarborough as well. And they had a school, another a school or initiative where they work with newly I can say returnees, people coming back home, to help them with language, help them in finding schools, and help them to integrate into the system. I think that's important. And to another point that you made, and going back and Brother Kofi tapping into what you said earlier about your work in regards to the internal liberation. A lot of us move to the continent with this kind of black capitalist type of mentality, right? Where we're not necessarily adding, but we come to exploit, because our currency, the money that we might be making, external money, international money, will have higher rates on the continent, and we become part of the problem. And we become part of the problem so much where they actually have divisions with continental Africans and African returnees, right? So it's important that those relationships, are healthy relationships. And when we go there, not to exploit, not to just raise the cost of living for people that are living on the continent. What does it mean? These are conversations we need to have. When you have a large number of people going to the continent with
Wow.
access to a certain amount of resources, what does it mean for the everyday continental person of the respected nation, and the cost of living, access to land? On social media, I always see those, on YouTube in particular, people moving back these big houses, buy it for only 100,000 US. What does that mean for continental African access to land? I think these are conversations that we need to have in healthy ways too. Yeah.
Mm, huge. That's such a huge part. There's something also quickly you mentioned about trade and investment. um
Mhm.
I think it was a group or something that you mentioned. And again, what the role of the economical development and even the financial literacy for our people relative
Mhm.
to how that translates on the continent versus that diaspora. It's something I think we should look at and see how we can engage that conversation as well as we move forward. I'd be really interested in your thoughts around that and how people can get involved in that way as well.
It depends on one area of expertise. What I'll say in Nairobi, in addition to Rwanda is doing their thing, but Kenya/Nairobi, it has become a cultural tech hub. on the African continent. So whilst I was there and part of the panel I was speaking on, you had young people who were young millionaires, right?
Wow.
So that do work around tech and payments. So for example, you know how you have e-transfer here, you know, in Ghana and those places, they have a different models. So a lot of young people are getting into those type of models, right? And it has become this haven, right, where you have a lot of African people, instead of leaving to go in school abroad, now they are staying home. They're invested in the development, right? So I'm saying this to say, based on your area of expertise, right? If that's what you into, and you know, could I can try to connect with organizations that are doing that type of work, you could bring that skill. So it goes back to what I was saying and what Brother Audrey mentioned, in the sense of what can you do for Africa, right? What can you do? One aspect, and it's already taking place from a nation to nation perspective. For example, being in Nairobi, I met and work and actually have some work to get to the office. The High Commission of Barbados in Nairobi is kind of serving, I should say, as that CARICOM umbrella, where they are working with people in the diaspora to talk about trade and investment, and to put them in right places, and also continental people how to invest in the Caribbean, different ways you could invest, right? So one thing, the Pan-African Council, the other group I'm involved with, that group is more about investment, trade, and working with industries, right? One of the things that we did, one of my colleagues who is the ambassador for the organization in South Africa, we welcome and work with the Colombian government to set up an office in South Africa, right? And through that, put them in position to trade from South Africa with folks in Colombia, right? So even some of my colleagues have led African leaders and investors to Asia to connect directly with China, Malaysia, and all those different spaces, and how we, and I say that to say, like, looking beyond or outside of the US and Canada. So it's happening from a nation member state perspective, and they have different ways that grassroots or people, private investors, could connect, you know, in those spaces, right? It's just like I said, it's based on your area of expertise, whether it's through education, how do you tap with folks in the schools and the universities, elementary school, etc. Whether it's about community health, what organizations are doing that type of work, how could we learn from each other? I strongly believe, like, you know, the solution for our situations, regardless of our respective location, has to be transnational. It has to be transnational. I give the example of how racial capitalism, wealth was created, and it did not stay within territories, but it went across borders. Hence, when we're dealing with the trauma and the violence of white supremacy, it has to go from a holistic piece as well. So, for example, the work you're doing with Black men right now, what work is taking place in people in Brazil, in Colombia, in Kenya, in Ghana, in St. Lucia, in Jamaica, in Trinidad, you know, in Europe, across Europe? I think those international conversations need to be had, and that could lead into what? A Black Men Summit, an international Black Men Summit, whether it's online, whether it's it could be online first, you put your various investment, then it become in person. It could be hybrid, right? So those come, and you find out the connection, some of the struggles and our success, we'll see some commonalities and some differences. How could we learn from each other? Going back to that that internal, you know, as Rex not to fall calling that internal external expression, learning about yourself and building with others externally, right? Yeah, man.
Huge. You said it, brother. You put it out into the ethers. So we're gonna be following up with some of the, you know, the opportunities that we can explore relative to a summit that's along those lines with the health and wellness work that we're doing here in Toronto with both young men and adult men, and how we can bridge those gaps and those connections is huge.
All right. Well, I think we may start lining it down, because I know you're 1 hour ahead of us. So it's a long night. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just finish up with a few comments and two quick questions. Mignon Cam says, Eugene, disability benefits are drastically low below the poverty line. Upcoming disability benefit is proposed $200 a month, when they know with people with disabilities spend 40%. And she says, I don't trust them to compensate reparations fairly. But Madonna says, we need systems in place to ensure accountability, like clear criteria, oversight, and public input. So it's not just another empty gesture. Without action, nothing changes. Let's see. That's what I learned from the Race and Disability Canada Leadership Team. It's been programmed from all the marketing and news delivered to us for generations. Marcia says, Scarberian's doing big things. I just want to two things I just want to close up on. First of all, how can individuals, particularly young people, contribute to the larger struggle for reparations and systemic justice?
I would, it's difficult to answer that question, but I would say is just spreading the word, like using social media. Like, for example, learning about reparations, and Canada might not have an actual framework, but what is it conversations are taking place in the US, or what conversations have taken place in Canada? Because in Nova Scotia, conversations are taking place in silos, but not from a national perspective, right? Learn about it and then see how you could bring it to your community. How do you have conversations? And it doesn't have to be like a panel or a big conference. It could be just in small exchanges. I think that's where the real, like, as a kitchen table talk, as they would say, as in grounding sessions, right? I think over dinner with family, hopefully, that the next time you ask a poll about Black Canadians deserving reparation or should get reparations, should be 100%. It's through those conversations, right? Tap in, bringing that conversation into school, right? Making it become part of your everyday, right? And then inviting, people are doing that work to talk. I always say Sakaya is someone I should, that should definitely speak a lot, because he could give you that historical context in more detail, which is tied to more global Black struggle, right? Yeah, so I would say, and bring the conversation into your respective spaces, whether it's in school, whether it's at home, whether it's your organization. How the work that you do in your respective space, how is it tied and connected to reparations in the way you think about justice, right? Because reparations is ultimately about justice.
Nice. And then what gives you hope for the future of the reparations movement in Canada and globally?
I think young people, like I say to my students all the time, I love the consciousness shift and the radicalism of young people. I'm not saying all young people, but there's a certain group of people. When my students, conversations I would be uneasy to introduce into the classroom. So is my right, white supremacy on the board? I'm always turning my back to students' responses, and they're like, yeah, white supremacy, capital patriarch. I'm like, whoa, so a lot of them, since I would say the last 4 or 5 years now, walking in this conversation, and they believe in justice. I'm not saying all of them, but they believe in justice. Why would someone discriminate against me based on my gender, my sex, my class, my nationality, my religion? They ultimately believe in gender. When you see in the summer of 2020, when you see what's taking place in the Middle East with the Palestine peace, the protests, is young people on the streets. So my hope nationally and globally is young people, right? Young people bringing that convert because they believe in justice. And some of them, they cannot fathom why people discriminate against them for those various political identities, right? So, and I think just we're in a critical time, a critical historical moment right now as well. Like I mentioned, the conversation about reparations is global, right? In Colombia, the government is leading. The government has a reparation national task force. Some of my colleagues are leading those pieces across Latin America, right? So I think, and even talking about Africa earlier on, with the African Union and grassroots and CARICOM and people in the African diaspora. Even a meeting like I was in earlier on last week, as I mentioned, part of the conversation was holding the Vatican responsible for crimes against humanity and the investments, right? So those conversations are taking place. I think we're in a critical moment right now. And I alluded to an article by Hilary Beckles earlier on, which is reparations, the biggest global movement, the most significant movement of the 21st century. So similar to the Pan-African movements, during independence movements in the 50s and 60s, you had Africa, various countries in Africa and the Caribbean receiving the independence. And then you had civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, Black Lives Matter. As of late, I think the reparations movement is at the forefront of that, where it's not just a civil society movement, but it's government in various spaces, right? But we have to be careful when government leading those initiatives, right? Because government changes and government could be corrupted, and sometimes government comes from corruption, right? But it has to be a people-led movement, right? Yeah, man. So that's my hope. Young people, and there's the political, the interesting historical moment that we're in right now. Yeah.
All right, Sadaf, Kofi, any final words for Chevy before we let him turn it down?
My brother, it was an honor to hold space with you and have a reasoning. I wish we could have been here again in on the same place, but the reasoning, the energy, the spirit was felt, and I'm glad that we were able to reconnect during Kwanzaa to make this happen. So,
Most definitely.
definitely in full support, and I definitely will be hitting you up in terms of finding out how I myself can get more educated and more involved in the reparations movement. So, giving thanks, for the edification and everything that you brought tonight.
Thanks.
Kofi?
Thanks.
100%. It's funny because it was said in the chat. We spoke about the connection between post-secondary education, academia, and our struggle. And oftentimes, as you know, the grassroots and academia have this tug of war. But I feel like hearing you speak today, I think we all can agree that you bridge those gaps in your conversation today. I mean, I feel like it's something that you do regardless. But I think today, one of the things that it did, even for listeners, I almost guarantee there's folks that are saying, well, maybe I should go pursue that degree, because I want to do something with this, with this wonderful brilliance that I have, knowing that if I connect it to a particular entity, it may provide more of a voice for what's needed and necessary on the ground. And that's, again, another conversation, but definitely giving thanks for the spark, my brother, that you brought tonight's call and conversation. I think it's part of the ancestors as well, speaking through you and supporting what's needed and necessary for our future change and growth. And that's one of the things that we are as vessels of our ancestors, right? So I'm so glad that you brought that today, and the energy and the spirit, and continue to support however we can support with what's being done on the ground, and definitely looking to connect some of the young men in this space and this conversation and have you come back, whether it's here or in the physical space.
Thanks, brother. And I'll just say one thing about that, even that connection, I never forget as a brother, Toronto, mentor at the time, was the mentor. I'm trying to bridge the community of university. And he said to me, why would you bridge community to a burning building? I always remember that. I always shared it academic spaces. I laughed like, and then you heard his silence, right? And I think what he said was so true. And so for me, thank you for saying that. That's what I'm trying to do. In my everyday, I've taken up Walter Ronnie's concept of the gorilla intellectual, where one have to commit, as Amilcar Cabral said, class suicide and learn from people, right? So as much as I'm the expert, I learn a lot of things I speak about is learning through people, right? Hey, and how they think about reparation, how they think about justice, and I'll make the connection based on my experiences. But I think all that comes from communities. Even when Brother Sadat, you mentioned about how you could contribute, I think you're already doing the work, and how I could learn from the work that you're doing to tie it to the reparations movement, right? Yeah, man. So give thanks.
All right, thanks.
Well, Chevy, thank you so much. I don't think this is the last time you're going to be with us. I'll just leave it at that. As always, don't just manage your time, manage your energy. Remember to give yourself grace. And if you're not making money, make history.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thank you
everybody.
for having
Thank
me.
you,
Good night, everyone.
Take care.
Yeah,
Keep
man.
the faith. All right, family. That is the way you can get in contact with him too. That is his email address. And I felt that we got a master class.
Master.
Yeah.
Master.
we got a master class tonight. Any last comments before we shut it down?
Yes, for folks, learn, study and embrace whatever you want to master, right? And that's an example of us having a master class. Dedicate your life to, making self, family, community better. And last, get involved. Get involved.
Mm-hmm. Every little thing counts.
Yeah.
Every little thing counts. Like, there you go. Got it here. Madonna Genius. It's been a pleasure. Great conversation. BM says, excellent conversation. Really informative. And I want to echo what Sadat is saying, that my way that I'm contributing is just providing a safe and based space for everyone for us to have these conversations. The nice thing is They ain't going anywhere unless YouTube takes us down. They ain't going. So we are in the present creating history.
Straight.
Yeah, 1,000%, brother. There's
In
a
the
there's a
present.
saying that said, one of the most dangerous things is a young person with a library card, and I think that's one of the pieces we need to look at relative to the future of our community. Is really the educational piece and what it looks like and how we can use it to empower our people. So Amakar Kabar was mentioned. I'm going to mention people like Ranoko Rashidi. I'm going to mention people that have been part of um, our liberation relative to how they dug into the intellectual space and how it translated. Dr. Joseph Binyakinan, folks, do the research, YouTube these folks, Google these folks, find out more information. I'm going to look into Zakiah Thomas because it's the first time I've heard Zakiah Thomas's name. That's my own ignorance. I'm going to learn more in regards to folks right now as well that are doing amazing work. He mentioned Hilary Beckles, the book. I wrote it down. It's going to come back to me. But all of this, what is the role of historians in our liberation? So do the research, do the work. Let's continue to educate ourselves and our community and continue to empower ourselves and find out more information about reparations, how you can get involved.
100%. All right, before we shut it down, as always, if you want to get in touch with us, there is Kofi's information on the screen. It's also on the platform. Most of the platforms you're watching this on that are run by me, there's Kofi Morris. There's his information. There's where you can get a hold of me. And then you can catch replays of this conversation on the Dr. Vibe Show on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Also, the Dr. Vibe Show website, Paul Osborne on Facebook, and NASA Community on YouTube. So I'll put up the NASA Community, get its own space. NASA Community gets its own space. All right. So as always, we want to say, live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. Block assumptions. Then aim bigger, aim better, aim higher, and wider. And if you can't, I'm gonna say, don't just. I'm gonna say, if you're not making money, make history. I knew I forgot, I botched it up, but we're gone.
It's all good.
We're all good. Take care, everybody. Keep the faith.
All right. Some of our parents, they're like, I have nothing to teach you. I don't know nothing.
My dad's at that point now. It says,
That's my point.
But I'm saying, no, Dad, you got lots more to give. You know how cold it is when these two brothers in their yard.
You know that. You know that. You don't know that, bro. You know
No
that.
joke.
I know we all have these things, but you know what? My go-to is this thing.
Wow.
Black book. It's in black.
Black book.
Men Talk, Black Book.